Should we just be able to say pretty much most things to one another? Is it nice? Should we be offended? Should we not do that? Where do we draw the line with all of this? Are you a free speech absolutist? What does that all mean and why?
I think there's worse things than being called a coconut. That's the first thing. The issue of free speech, I think, as people have been speaking through this evening, is absolutely essential at this point in time. If we're serious about taking society forward, if we're serious about progress, then we have to be, to a degree, free speech absolutists.
That's very clear. Ben, you've come under fire for some of the things that you've said, and some of the things you haven't said that people think you've said as well. But just how do you respond to some of those things? You know, how do you see this? Is it the case that some people are just thriving on this? They're just being outrageous for the sake of it, and they're not really. They want to create problems. What is the argument, the rationale for free speech for everyone, as you see it, or not?
Before I address that, can I just commend you, Alan, on the terrific conference you put on tonight? I'm ashamed to say that this is only my second event with Together. The first event was 3 years ago, I think in a basement of a restaurant, and there were about 20 of us. And the reason I haven't been to subsequent events is, some of you may know, I was trying to help build a political party that's done rather well recently. But I've definitely... that was a backslap on my own back there, by the way. But I've definitely come to the right conference today, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And Bev, I love you too. Thank you very much for all your kind words at the beginning. So on free speech, of course we have a right to free speech, and we must exercise it. In the pursuit, I may be jumping ahead and stealing my own thunder, but in the pursuit of liberalism, in the pursuit of championing individuals' rights, we have come to a juncture in this country where we can't deny an individual even ludicrous claims, such as women having penises, for example, or that, and as innocent as it might first seem, that Black Lives Matter, because that somehow, you know, the pursuit and the promotion of protected characteristics has, and, you know, which has come through this form of liberalism, has required us to shut down free speech, because you can't challenge the ridiculous pursuit of liberalism. The individual has gone too far. The individual has been promoted too far. And I don't think it's any accident, Alan, that your organization is called Together, because I think we all inherently recognize that whilst human rights are critical, the championing of the individual is vital as well. It has to be in balance with the collective. And in the pursuit of this liberalism, I'll get to the point, in the pursuit of this liberalism, we've made it verboten to challenge liberalism and the rights to express the most ridiculous things, like, for example, women have penises. And so we must re-engage with free speech. It's absolutely critical that we do so. I would, however, also just say that it's a terrific privilege to have the ability to sit on a podium like this and speak. People actually, may believe what it is that we say, and with that comes a responsibility. And so I've always tried to exercise my right for free speech with respect for others, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
So, Claire, you wrote a book some years ago that I find that offensive, and particularly talking about some of your experience, not that you find it offensive, but it was for those that haven't read it, but it was a discussion of that claim. I find that offensive, therefore shut up, you're not allowed to say it, and criticizing that and engaging with it. And particularly you gave some examples about when you talk at universities and with young people, and we've seen some of the things that happen in the academy and cancelling, and that spreading to not just companies but across society. not being overly dramatic, because obviously you put the sound there for some nervousness there. Where do you see things in terms of younger people? I mean, are we just a bunch of old farts having this conversation, right? And young people are like, no, you just cannot have free speech. It's too utterly disgusting, and it's not. Or do you think that there's a sense in which the baton has been and can be passed on? And how do you see all of that?
So I think I was trying to hint at the beginning that it can be easy for a crowd like ours to kind of blame Generation Snowflake, blame Gen Zers and say, aren't they useless wimps? And even the people who want to speak out haven't got the courage. You know, what's wrong with them? And I think that really the theme of what I was talking about was that we need to be a bit more self-critical. Not just of, you know, people of our age, but actually people who claim to be on the side of free speech will very often be inconsistent. And why that matters in terms of where we're at the moment is that you can't blame you know, young 18, 19-year-olds for not understanding the importance of free speech, because the political class and the people who run society and the people who are claiming to stand up for a liberal democracy have betrayed free speech. They never argue for it. I mean, most 19, 18-year-olds I meet have never heard the arguments for why free speech is the bedrock of a democracy. They're not familiar. It's not just that they've never heard of J.S. Mill. I mean, they've certainly not read it. You know what I mean? They haven't read Locke. They're not familiar with the classics. But it's not that you all have to go off and read those books. But they're not familiar with the philosophical and ideological underpinnings of freedom and what it's gained over the years. So they really do have a kind of tagline, which is, oh, you just want absolute free speech so you can spout your racist hate speech and your bigotry. And so you have to challenge them. I'm suggesting that we don't do that very well or often enough, and we don't do it consistently. I'll come back because I've spoken too much.
So, Kunle, you've worked as a representative of trade unions. You said what used to be called the left. What happened to the left with free speech, and how much do you see in these discussions, particularly around identity, that not being able to have these discussions and thrash them out as a problem, as ossifying problems?
First of all, just picking up on Claire's point. About 5 years ago, I attended an event at the Free Word Center in Islington, which is the center put together by Jewish refugees to protect freedom of expression and the free word in terms of the written word. And I attended a poetry event run by young people, predominantly engaged with by young people who were absolutely opposed to the notion of free speech. As far as they were concerned, it was the property of the far right, and they did not see any value in it at all. So your point about not understanding it, the truth of the matter is there are many people, unfortunately, from our generation who, when free speech has been tested, were not able to stand up and show the kind of bravery and integrity to defend it. And as a consequence now, there is no understanding of free speech. Even our political class has a tendency to say, yeah, we're for free speech, but for those people I agree with, not those people whose views might be contrary to my own. So that's the first thing. In terms of the labor movement, I'm afraid it hasn't shown, again, the depth of integrity in this place. We remember through our colleges the whole issue of no platforming people in discussions around, for example, fascism and far-right groups. And we always made the point, even 20 years ago, what this could potentially lead to in terms of its consequences. Back in the 1930s, we know the Public Order Act was campaigned for by left-wingers to drive fascist demonstrations out of working class communities in the East End of London. The 1936 Public Order Act, when it was passed, was not then used to simply deal with those fascist groups. In fact, the very people opposed to fascists found that their demonstrations, their right to assembly, was also attacked. And so I'm afraid there's a lot of education that needs to be developed, not just in relation to our students, but we need to almost like have a reaction to the situation we're in now through an educational program that goes back and gives people a thorough understanding of why the principle is important to defend.
Many years ago, Ben, I was in New York and I got up and I went to speak at the New School on an issue on racism, and you could just tell that everyone was like, you shouldn't be speaking here, because obviously you're a white man, what are you doing? And I think that we've adopted some of the outlook of America, unfortunately, in terms of that stuff. I wonder, this conversation about integration versus multiculturalism, about our identities, and do we have more in common with one another? And what the majority of the British public and how they see it, and the question of free speech and all of that. How do you think this is? I mean, you campaigned, we interviewed you in Wellingborough, both in the locals and the nationals. You were speaking to people all the time. How did you think this, when you're talking to constituents and the public and more broadly, how do you think they see this question? And is there anger? Is there fear? Where do you see it?
So just going back to the theme about liberalism, in the pursuit of liberalism, in the pursuit of everyone's right to be heard, to practice their own culture, to have their own religious beliefs, their own sexual preferences, their own identity, whether they're LGBTQ plus whatever, we have sought to give that, we've sought to protect these people, these minority interests, these minority beliefs, so that they can flourish. And in the pursuit of that protection, we've come up actually with regulations. It's not woke. Woke is not a social fad. Woke is actually a social manifestation of government regulation and legislation. And we have given protected status, literally, to the kinds of groups that I've just described. And many of you would have heard me speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is the opposite, frankly, of being diverse, inclusive, and equal. When you give protected status to a particular group of people of the type that I've just described, what in essence you're doing is discriminating against the majority. And so they couch it in very positive language. They say it's positive discrimination. We're giving everyone a fair shake of the dice. We're giving everyone the opportunity to go forward in life. But actually what they're doing is introducing racism into society. And when I grew up, Zubi and I had a good chat about this on GB News. I don't know if, Bev, you were presenting at the time. I think you were presenting, actually. And what we've created is a demand for racism in society. When I was growing up, it was frankly absent. I'm half Pakistani. My mother, who is sitting in the audience, was born in Isleworth, blonde. She was blonde, she's now grey. Blue eyes. And I was brought up and I was drilled with the belief that everyone is equal. It didn't matter what damn color you were, what religion you were, what sexual preferences you had. Everyone is equal. And we don't have that anymore. Some people are more equal than others. If you're if you're from any one of those minority groups, you get a leg up. This daft government, I don't know if you picked it up in the King's speech, but this daft government is going to legislate for equal pay for ethnicities and for employers to keep a record of the different ethnicities they employ to demonstrate regulatorily that everyone is being paid equally. Now, the last time we kept a record, or people kept records, of the different ethnicities in their employment was a couple of 100 years ago, and it was effectively during the slave trade, and we're heading in an absolutely insane direction. And I just want to say one more thing before I hand over. Catherine talked about multiculturalism. On the right, people arguing multiculturalism doesn't work. On the left, they celebrate it. Multiculturalism, practiced in the way that we're practicing it, is encouraging cultural silos. It's encouraging people to disengage from being British. It is discouraging people from believing in the United Kingdom because they're told they can have views that frankly are antipathetic to our culture, to our customs, and to our beliefs. And they will be at liberty to practice that. So liberalism needs a good blooming reining in, and we need to come together, and we need to be able to speak freely, and we need to drill one thing home repeatedly: everyone is equal.
Okay, thank you. In a minute, we're going to have the mics down the front because we've got some people who want to speak and say some things and put some questions to the panelists, both from members and some of the campaigners and activists that are here. But Claire, so I want to ask you, because I really enjoyed your introduction, and I think it's what's important as well is you didn't just do a binary thing. You know, there are some people who are on the far right who really are on the far right, and there are really some racists, and there are people who are involved in doing things in the same way we've seen some Nazi salutes on some marches. We've seen them also on Palestine demos. We've seen them on some of the Unite the Kingdom demo marches, but obviously not all are then far right. These questions that are so thorny, like a discussion of integration, the question of radical Islamicism versus 4 million Muslims in Britain, how do you see us having these conversations in a spirit of having more in common with one another, but being able to criticize things that are a challenge to our way of life, let's say?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, you know, it's really unusual, and to your credit, that you've encourage this conversation tonight, because actually these conversations are not happening enough, and all ideas are not equal. I mean, I'm so tempted. I really want to kind of get stuck in and attack what Ben said and disagree with him. No, we haven't got time to indulge me. But luckily, everybody, you can come to the Battle of Ideas Festival on the 19th and 20th of October, because we are actually, seriously, we've got panels on the rise of ethnic conflict, on the problems of multiculturalism. I think Ben's speaking on whether we should have a patriotic curriculum in schools. But we've got debates on economy, science, and all the rest of it. I'm quite serious, though. We've got to remember that not all ideas are equal, and therefore we've got to critique each other's ideas. The problem too often is that we just dismiss other people's ideas and we don't engage with them. It's just kind of lazy. You just go, oh yeah, they're just the woke left, and walk away, and don't ever think about it. So the point then that we've got is that, as Kunle says, we end up in a situation where we don't even know our own tradition, the ideas that inform of the fact that we're free speechers. You can't just keep saying, I'm for free speech, and then not have actually any idea at all how you argue for it, or all the difficulties historically and how we got here. You can't just say, oh, multiculturalism is, you know, is really, I despise multiculturalism. You can't just say that phrase. You've got to then work out, well, when did it come about that people moved from a situation where anti-racism really was that people united, you know, black and white unite and fight, and turned into a policy in which people were encouraged by councils on the left and the right to actually identify with their ethnicity and their cultural background, and were actually even given advantage to do so. These are important things for us to have a bit more depth in, to kind of get to grips with. And I suppose that when you're saying to me, Alan, you know, how do you kind of have these difficult arguments? It's not with ease. We've got a panel debate at the Battle of Ideas called Islam versus Islamism versus Islamophobia. And I can tell you now, I'm nearly having nightmares, dreading what's going to happen with that panel. And quite a lot of people have refused to speak on it. And they've told me that they'd like to, but they can't. And I think that that's why I was trying to say, we can all say we're courageous and brave, but actually very often we avoid the hard arguments, prefer to stay in our own echo chambers, and then just point the finger at the other side and say, oh, they're all, you know, they're just all woke and useless and all the rest of it. That's not good enough if we're actually going to change society for the better, in my opinion.
Right.